Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. With me today, as usual, our regular commentators. Regena Nelson is on my right. Regena is from the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies at Western Michigan University and the College of Education and Development. And Don Cooney is in the School of Social Work.
Yep.
At Western Michigan University, and he also serves as a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. Well, happy 2023. This is our first program during the new year. We had hoped to tape a program a little bit earlier than this, but for a variety of reasons, we didn't get a chance to record a show till toward the end of January here. But we had envisioned a program where we would look back at 2022, some of the more important events that happened that we probably talked about and discussed a little bit, and then to kind of look ahead prospectively to the year 2023. What were the big stories that we thought were going to be looming out there during this year that we probably will be talking about at greater length later on? So we're going to stick with that particular script. And so, Regena, I've got you in the leadoff position today. What do you think about 2022? What stood out to you as the big stories, the big issues from last year?
Yeah. One of the big stories, of course, was the overturning of the Roe versus Wade decision.
Yeah, that was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, for 50 years, there was legal protection for the right to an abortion. And then when that went away, it paved the way for states then to have their own rules and regulations about that. And when we talk about that, many states had banned abortions already. So there were women, literally, when the decision was made, who had abortions scheduled and would not be able to have them. And so we saw like this chain reaction of people going to different states and then states getting ready to counteract this with their own responses. And for example, here in Michigan, we were able to get a proposal on the ballot to protect reproductive freedom here. And we saw that that was supported in our state. And so now that is a constitutional amendment that here in Michigan, women have the right to abortion, they have reproductive freedom. And what that means is that it's not just access to abortion, we know that, but it's the whole issue of a woman's bodily autonomy that's so important in their health, to make decisions about their own health, because there is this ripple effect of when a woman is denied an abortion, we know it has many impacts beyond just her. If she has to support a child that she doesn't have the resources for, that can cause her to go into debt. It could lead to bankruptcy. It could lead to eviction. And so there are long-term consequences of being denied an abortion in that case. If they want that economic security, once they have to have a child and they're denied an abortion, they may stay in a relationship that's not safe for that economic security. And that also has an impact on women. We also see that when a woman doesn't have the resources to support an additional child and you bring one into a family, it has an impact not on just that child that's being born, but the other children in the family, their development, their security, their education. So we see that also being why this decision is so important to women, that we want to have that choice, and we should have that choice. And so clearly there was overwhelming support, public support. There was, if you interview people, they had 60% supported reproductive rights, reproductive freedom. And when these things were on the ballot, it drove people to vote during the midterm elections. And so we also saw the impact on who was voted in during midterm elections. So this was a big issue for so many reasons, and it's one that we still continue to deal with on many levels. And the fight isn't over in many places, but we understand now the impact of this. And so hopefully we can restore those rights as much as we can.
One of mine coming up is the midterm elections, and you tied it in so nicely there. It did have a huge impact, didn't it? There was an expected red wave, an expected strong turnout for Republicans in both the Senate, to retake the Senate and to take the House, and a lot of other elections, and that didn't materialize.
Right.
It was a very slight pink puddle, if anything.
Exactly.
And I think that the Roe decision was one of the key factors in driving out people to vote for Democratic candidates as opposed to Republican candidates in the midterm election. So it had a huge impact politically, as well as all the other ways, socially and economically, that you're pointing out. So yeah, I think that was one of the biggest stories of the year for sure. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Another one that I've been watching as an educator is what is the impact of COVID and the pandemic on children's educational progress? When COVID happened and there were lockdowns, students were pulled out of school, they had to learn remotely, and I applaud educators in schools that did that quick pivot to understand how to deliver instruction remotely, how to get supplies, computers, internet access as much as they could out to parents and families so they could continue the education of their children. But we do know that even with all of that going on, that some children did fall through the cracks. They weren't able to access the systems they needed to take part in education that was delivered remotely. So that became an issue, and we knew that they were going to be falling behind. So this was the spring of one school year, and as we still tried to figure out vaccines and what was safe, many kids still couldn't go back the following school year in person. And some schools did make decisions to do it, but they all had, district by district decision-making power on what, should you hold school in person? Should it be remote? Should it be hybrid? And also looking at the safety of their teachers too. So a lot of factors went into those decisions. So we do know that the quality of education during that year and a half wasn't ideal. And we knew there would be an impact, and we were kind of bracing for it when students came back this fall in 2022 in person, and we started to do some testing to see what was the impact. So we have national testing that goes on, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, where you test fourth graders and eighth graders every other year. Those results have been released to show that there was a significant decline in educational scores, educational achievement since 2019 in math and reading. So we were expecting that. We know that, and it was sort of across the board. Even high achieving children went down some. So students who had a lot of, they weren't also like just moving steadily along as well. But we saw the greatest decline, and it widens the gap for students of color, students with disabilities, English language learners, low-income students. They're falling further behind. And so that is something that we're watching as a field. And it's a perfect storm because what we need now is more resources in the schools to help, remediate some of these issues that we saw, the loss that we've learned. But at the same time, we're facing a teacher shortage. So instead of having classrooms fully staffed and more resources coming in to help these students, we have less. So it's not getting better. And I know that we are looking at budgets now, state budgets, federal budgets, that are putting more resources and more support to recruit more teachers, to bring in more staff who can deal with some of the issues that the students are facing because of trauma. But because it's harder to keep teachers and educational staff, it's going to be a slow path to getting back to where we want to be to help these students make up those learning losses, particularly because of some of the traumatic effect of the pandemic. We know that parents lost jobs during the pandemic. People lost family members. All of the stress that was going on in these households impacts the children, their learning, their brain development as well. So now we're coming back with a new group of students who are still processing all of this trauma and stress, and that's difficult. Teachers have to figure out how to deal with some of those behaviors, as well as their own trauma that they felt, trying to wear all of these hats. And we're seeing with our studies that there's an increase in anxiety and depression among our students. It's at record levels. And what we saw was when they were removed from school, which for many children was their safe place, and now you remove them from that and they're at home where sometimes they're not safe, that there are issues that they're dealing with because of that. There's some safety issues that they experience that they should not have, but because they weren't able to be in school. And just that loss of social connection. Yeah, and the social skills that have to happen while you're in school and to develop, we're seeing that there's the impact of that as well, that students are exhibiting some signs of lack of social development that can lead to some behaviors, riskier behaviors with drug use and violence and even sex that we're all going to have to watch and address with this generation of students who experience this disruption in their school. So that is the big one as educators, that we really have to dig deep and think about how do we bring in other community partners, other resources to help these children.
Yeah, I remember talking to Dr. Michael Rice, and I said to him, boy, we really had to do something this summer with these kids falling behind in their classes. He says the most important thing is social, that the social skills, that the social environment that they missed is just having such a huge impact on them. And we don't have the resources in the schools to address those issues and the mental health issues.
Right.
I mean, like, if you have one social worker for several schools, as we do, and then I know of other school districts where they have 2 or 3 social workers in the same school. The disadvantage of those kids is going to be really detrimental to their whole future.
Exactly, exactly. So I have to understand where our priorities are. Either take care of this now, or we're going to see these issues along later in life, and we'll be taking care of it at a higher price tag. So we're desperate to figure this out.
As with so many issues, it's the old Fram oil filter commercial dilemma. Remember that commercial where the greasy mechanic says, well, you can pay me now to install the Fram oil filter, or you can pay me later
Right,
when I have
exactly.
to rebuild your engine, right?
Exactly.
Exactly.
And so the investment of resources up front, is really,
Cheaper.
Paying now turns out to be cheaper and
Yeah.
beneficial in all
Right.
kinds of ways for the students.
Exactly, exactly. So priorities.
The governor gave her State of the Union, or State of the State address, last week. And did she mention any provision of new resources to address some of these problems that you've just discussed, Regina?
So yes, the one that we're very excited about is we know that the greatest investment in a social program is investing in early childhood programs, making sure that those students have what they need to begin school not behind but ready to go. In preschool, high quality preschool provides that. And so she has made a promise that the funding will be there for all 4-year-olds to experience and have a high quality preschool experience. And that is huge, because we have research that shows that in that preschool environment, they're getting the social, they're getting the emotional, they're getting the academic support, and they also work with families. And this is a state-funded preschool model she's talking about, and expanding that, which is shown to be high quality. So that is a huge step in the right direction, as well as she knows that students who are in schools now, there's going to be more funding for tutors. Reading, she knows that because of the low reading scores, that we'll also have to have more funding for reading support for our students.
So,
Go ahead.
okay.
Okay, the only thing I was going to say is, you mentioned too, the shortage of teachers. So with all this expansion that we definitely need, addressing that issue of trying to get qualified people into those positions is going to be a huge challenge.
Exactly. And I think that was the big response from the field, is that we can't staff all of the classrooms we have now,
Yeah,
and you're
right.
talking about expanding.
Yeah.
So
But
what
we
will
have
we
to
do?
do it.
Exactly. We have to provide a salary that keeps people in these positions, because they love this work and they love teaching.
Yeah.
But they have to be able to feed their families.
Does Michigan have a 4K grade statewide, or is it just some districts do, some districts don't? So a grade before kindergarten, right? Where 4-year-olds and
Exactly.
early 5-year-olds to
Yes,
take.
so in Michigan, there's funding across the state. Districts submit proposals for the amount of slots that they have to receive that funding. And then there's also some money set aside for private funders, to child care centers, to get some of that money as well. But they have to meet those same regulations.
So this is part of the governor's plan to expand that
To
4K
expand
grade.
it, exactly. Yep, so that everybody will have that 4-year-old experience.
So there are other models out there, right? There are, I think, 8 states that do this now. Yeah, I think Oklahoma, they say,
Yes,
is the
yep,
model.
Yep, yep.
Wisconsin, my grandson,
Ah.
Cal, is in a 4K,
Ah.
and his two older brothers both did 4K in their school district there
Yes.
in Wisconsin, north of Milwaukee. So.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yep. So regardless of income, so now ours is income based. Who gets to these funds? Who has the free preschool? But now she's removing that.
Right. Big, big.
All right, what's number 3 on your list?
Number 3, because it's related, as you know, we're looking at the teacher shortage and the shifts in the labor market this year. We saw that once COVID, people were able to go back, that we still saw that there were 10 million jobs out there available for people, but only like 5.7 million people to fill these jobs. And so we're looking at this huge shift in our labor market of the need for people to fill these positions. And there are industries that have been hit very hard. Of course, food service, hospitality, retail, they're all struggling because of, you know, pay. That people were able to find some positions maybe in other places and decided that they would take those other offers. We also saw during COVID, some people used that time to increase their skills, go back to school. So they were taking these jobs, unskilled jobs, but then once they got skills, they were able to take higher paying jobs. So we saw some of that. And then people called it just a great resignation. People just opting out of the job force for a variety of reasons. Some of them, it was childcare. So we're talking now about staffing. We saw particularly it hit women hard who, if they could not find childcare, they could not go back to work. So we saw that as well. People who were sick, who were still suffering from COVID symptoms and couldn't go back to work. So we had a variety of reasons why we have this gap in the labor force right now. And the people who are left behind feel like overworked because they're understaffed. And so now we're looking at some issues with unsafe working conditions, and now that people are speaking up about it and even going on strike. So we saw that with the railroads, we see that with nurses, and even some teachers have been able to strike. And so people are now starting to see that they have the power to speak up about the needs that they do, the needs that they have for safe working conditions and fair working conditions. So we'll see more unions as well being developed to protect workers' rights. So it's interesting how the labor force is changing and what our needs are and how this is going to impact everything. And people go to the grocery stores and they see empty shelves or you can't find someone to help you. So everybody has felt this a little bit.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Right.
All right, those are very insightful, those 3. So, Don, you want me to go next, right?
Yeah,
I
go.
like to bat second, and you're a good third hitter. You have a little bit more power than I do. So the first thing I had on my list was actually the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
You know, which last February, after months of a military buildup and, of course, years of prior maneuvering over the issue with NATO expansion and, you know, the demise of the former Soviet Union and Putin's turn to increasingly authoritarian tactics. And so there'd been a long buildup to this. But finally, Putin carried out the invasion February 24th. And again, thinking it would be a quick and easy victory, but it's turned into a long, protracted, brutal war. And it's still ongoing almost a year later now. And of course, one of the most unsettling, there are many dimensions that could be addressed with regard to the war in Ukraine, but the most unsettling thing, of course, was that Putin started to make rather thinly veiled threats that he was going to use nuclear weapons if need be in the situation, that if the West, NATO, or any of the Ukrainian allies tried to resist, that you know, he has nuclear weapons, and he was certainly able and willing to use them in some form. And so it kind of brought back, you know, it's always been there, the nuclear threat, the nuclear danger has always been there, but it kind of brought it back in a way that the world had not experienced for quite some time. And so that was one of the most unsettling things, the prospect of nuclear warfare again, even if it was just that the Russian were going to use tactical nuclear weapons rather than strategic weapons, you know, the ICBMs and such. but just to use what are called battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, that would have been stepping over a very important red line, and would have had tremendously, horrific consequences, and who knows where that could lead to, of course. So the reemergence of the nuclear threat, at least to our consciousness, I think was one of the big issues of the year. And by the way, every January, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists talks about their doomsday clock. The doomsday clock goes back to 1947. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists were created in 1945, right at the end of World War II. These were many of the atomic scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project. And they had been concerned about the use of the weapon that they had created, especially once the threat of Hitler getting the bomb was gone, and the war in Europe was winding down or ending. Then they said, no, this should not be used against the Japanese. We were only trying to do this to head off Hitler getting the bomb. And so we don't think that the weapon that we've created should be used against the Japanese. And they were quite vociferous about that. Wow. There were many, many of the atomic scientists who fought very hard against that. Well, of course, the weapons were used in August of 1945. And once the war completely ended, then the atomic scientists spoke out that there had to be international controls over atomic weapons, atomic energy. And they created this Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. That's the name of the organization. Then they also had first a newsletter, and then a magazine or a journal was created. And the very first issue in 1947 featured an artist's conception of what was called came to be called the Doomsday Clock. Right. And so the idea is that midnight represents the apocalypse, right? That's the full-out exchange of nuclear weapons, the end of the world. And so we don't want to get to midnight, right? But how close are we to midnight, or how close or far away are we to midnight? Well, initially in 1947, they set the clock at 7 minutes to midnight. And it has, advanced and retreated. At the end of the Cold War, when we thought we had what Jonathan Shell called the gift of time to finally abolish nuclear weapons. Why did we need nuclear weapons anymore? The Soviet Union was gone. The new Russian Federation was our friend. Why did we need to have nuclear weapons? Why didn't we take advantage of this opportunity, the gift of time, to disarm? We didn't, of course. But at that point, the clock was set at 17 minutes to midnight. Wow. At the end of the Cold War.
Wow.
Well, in 2020, because of efforts to modernize and expand the nuclear weapon arsenals of both Russia and the United States, because of climate change, the Bulletin became very concerned with the climate crisis, figured that had to be added into the equation. And so in 2020, they set the clock at 100 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it had ever been, 100 seconds to midnight. They kept that setting in 2021 and 2022, although they said, look, things haven't gotten any better. We're not improving in any ways. The threat is still there. Climate change. They kept talking about corrupted information systems and, of course, the lack of leadership by the world's political leaders. And then, of course, once, so they kept it at 100 seconds in 2022. But of course, 1 month later, the war in Ukraine begins when Putin invades. Wow. And so I knew that they were going to have to reset it. And I was just trying to figure out, I followed this very, very closely. I was trying to figure out where they were going to set it. I actually thought maybe they would set it at 1 minute to midnight. Wow. I thought that would be the most dramatic statement they could make. Well, they revealed the new setting this week, and it's 90 seconds to midnight. Well, again, the closest it has ever been to midnight, 90 seconds to midnight, a minute and a half. That was the new setting. So again, I thought that the Ukrainian war was an important issue for many, many reasons throughout the last year. The reemergence of the consciousness of the nuclear threat, and now the setting of the doomsday clock. I think that's a big story. And so that's not only for last year, but now, of course, following into this year with the new setting of the clock. And, of course, a number of the Ukrainian allies are sending tanks to Ukraine now. And again, the threats are still there. The uncertainty still reigns. And, you know, we've got to figure out how are we going to deal with this situation? How are we going to have some kind of negotiated settlement to end this brutal, bloody war? And I think that's going to be one of the key issues to follow throughout this coming year. So I'll jump ahead and do 2023 because it flows from this first one in terms of the Russian invasion. Well, so that's an issue that I think is really important.
Before you go beyond that, that was great, Ron. What I see happening too is now more nations saying we have to have nuclear weapons, right? Saudi Arabia and other countries. And I see it similar to what's happening in this country, where everybody has to have a gun because we have no faith that there is any institution out there that can protect us, so we all have to have guns. And I see that happening with nuclear weapons, which much more dangerous.
Right.
So that's a deep concern for me.
And of course, this was a concern 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that nuclear weapons would proliferate, they would spread. And so the international community actually came together in 1968 and created a treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was created in 68, it went into effect in 1970, and the grand bargain at that time was that the 5 nations that had nuclear weapons at that point, the big 5, you know, that won World War II and were the members of the Security Council of the United Nations, the nuclear club, they had weapons, but if the rest of the world agreed not to develop nuclear weapons, right, that was the bargain. If the rest of the world agreed they weren't going to take that route, and of course a number of them were on the verge of doing so at that time. South Africa was one, as you well know, at that point. So the bargain was if the rest of the world said we won't develop nuclear weapons, then the nuclear club said we will eventually disarm. We will move forward toward disarmament. Well, the rest of the world kept their part of the bargain for the most part, right? Now, the nuclear club has expanded from 5 to 9. Israel has nuclear weapons, although they refuse to acknowledge that they have nuclear weapons, but they probably have 250 or so warheads. They joined the club. They never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. India and Pakistan never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They both have since developed nuclear weapons. And the ninth member of the club, of course, is North Korea, who did sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 80s, but then rescinded their signature and now have developed nuclear weapons and that remains such a contentious issue for American administrations to try to deal with. So we have 9 members of the club now. But for the most part, the rest of the world kept their end of the bargain, but of course the nuclear club did not. And so there's a solemn legal obligation under international law to disarm. We are required to disarm. We are required to abolish nuclear weapons under international law, but we refuse to do it. And of course, instead of moving in that direction, instead what we've done is to expand and modernize our arsenals. And so, and now, of course, with the war in Ukraine, it's going to be even more difficult to kind of get back to arms control negotiations. But the only treaty that we have right now with Russia, the only remaining treaty is the New START treaty that Barack Obama was able to negotiate, and Joe Biden extended it once he came into office, but it expires in 3 years. And it's hard to see now how, you know, for the next 3 years, are we going to be able to negotiate with Vladimir Putin and create an extension of the New START or create a new treaty? That doesn't seem very likely at this point. So the only remaining treaty that we have is in jeopardy. And of course the rest, you know, the nuclear club refuses to abide by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I'll just throw one other thing in. We can spend an hour talking about this or more, but there is also a new treaty now, the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, which was created by the UN General Assembly in 2017. And has been ratified and has now gone into force. although the 9 nuclear weapons countries have
Not signed on.
they've not signed, they didn't participate in the process, they've tried to sabotage it in any way that they can, and they refuse to participate. But the rest of the world came together and said, we're going to create a treaty that specifically prohibits nuclear weapons, right? Non-proliferation is one thing, to say you're going to disarm to prevent non-proliferation, but to say nuclear weapons are illegal, they can't be, you can't have them, you can't create them, you can't do anything except get rid of them. And the rest of the world has come together to say that. And so we do have this very strong treaty that has gone into force at the United Nations General Assembly. But again, the nuclear powers still refuse to participate in that process. And again, to get there, there has to be international cooperation, right? And the war in Ukraine undermines international cooperation on every front that we can think of.
So just on the Ukraine thing, I find myself very torn in this whole thing. We just celebrated the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, and in his speech against the war in Vietnam, he said there are 3 things that we have to really fight against: racism, poverty, and militarism. But with the Ukraine thing, the militarism is tremendously expanding. And it just reinforces the idea that the only way to solve a problem is through military force. And that's become the acceptable way that we're working on this whole thing. And when you see the terrible damage that is done to the Ukrainian cities and the people, it's just so heartbreaking. And then the other thing is the world food supply. What this has done to the world food supply. You hear people like Medea Benjamin and Code Pink, who I really trust Medea Benjamin, speaking out strongly against the militarism. On the other hand, it doesn't seem reasonable that we let Russia just do that and do the terrible things that they're doing there. So I find myself very torn in this whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're kind of back to the Fram oil filter thing, you know. At the end of the Cold War, we didn't take advantage of the opportunity. Jonathan Shaw was exactly right. This is a gift of time to be utilized, because that's not always going to be there.
Yep.
You know, things can unravel. And of course they have unraveled, but of course it unraveled because the United States did not take advantage of the end of the Cold War to move toward disarmament. It didn't rein in NATO. You know, it went ahead and expanded NATO.
Right.
It did everything that it could to push the Russians in bad directions. And of course, if you push people in bad directions, then they end up doing very bad things. And of course, we don't want people to do very bad things like invading Ukraine. And so that's where we're sort of caught. How do we respond now to this brutal, illegal invasion when so much of what we failed to do in the post-Cold War period led up to this situation that created this monster? And so that's the dilemma that we're facing right now.
Yes, it is.
Well, we're already past the halfway point, and we still are dealing with 2022. The other thing that I'll mention is that I was very disappointed in the outcome of the climate conference that was held in Egypt. I had hoped that this would be the year we would get even more clarity about how we're going to mitigate carbon emissions, how we're going to reduce carbon emissions. Paris was the breakthrough in 2015, and since then we've been trying to, how are we going to actually bring this about, create the political pressure for emissions reductions, and we're still failing to do that. We did come up, as we discussed on this program, with a program to help those nations who are most affected by the climate crisis, by climate disruptions, to help them deal with the financial cost of dealing with those catastrophes. And so that was an important step forward. But we failed in terms of the issue of reducing emissions. And again, I want to go back to the war in Ukraine just briefly, because it so disrupts the possibility of international cooperation. I mean, the only way we can solve the climate crisis is through global cooperation, right? Planetary cooperation. And if we don't have the political will to do that, to engage in constructive negotiations, and of course now you bring China in there too, because China obviously has the most emissions currently, although the United States historically and cumulatively has created the most emissions, but China has, with its economic development now, as the world leader in emissions. And what role, so we seem to be wanting to kind of enter into a new Cold War with China, and what's China's role with Russia. And so the whole international situation right now is very unsettled because of Ukraine, because of the tense relations between China and the United States. And so again, how are we going to move forward through the international community to deal with the problem of the climate crisis? So that's another major concern I have. So again, I guess I'm not only talking about what happened in 2022, but how that extends into 2023 and beyond as well. And the other one I've already mentioned, the outcome of the midterm elections. Regina talked about the abortion issue. I think that was so critical. And the fact that the red wave didn't materialize meant that the Senate remains in Democratic control. The House did go to the Republicans, and by a very narrow margin, the narrowest of margins. And of course, there's all kinds of problems and disruptions that are going to result from that, but we'll wait to get into that for 2023. But I want to go now to Professor Cooney, because I want to hear
okay, there's
what
a
he thinks
lot to
about.
talk about on those last points, but we can't do. So I thought I'd talk about local and the implications of the things that you're talking about locally. And there's three areas that I want to talk. First of all, public safety. And then secondly, a two-generation approach to our people succeeding in the city. And then the third area, I thought a little bit about the pollution, the issue of pollution, and that's killing people in our city. So first of all, on the idea of violence in the city. Actually, the statistics are that's going down. But one of the things that we face in the city is proliferation of guns. I mean, every single day almost, we're picking up, when they do a stop, they find guns in the car. And that's just setting the stage for more and more violence in the city. The city cannot limit, we cannot set rules about how we contain guns in the city. That's got to be state or federal. And so we're handicapped in that. But I think one of the things that we're doing, Ron, you've been an advocate of this for 30 years or more, a public health approach to it. And the public health approach is about prevention. It's about setting a situation in the city which keeps people safe without punishing people. It's about looking at the people that are in danger of getting involved in the violence, and it's about working with the people that are already there but not too deeply in. And we're working on that, especially through group violence intervention, where we go out and we identify the people that are in danger to fall into this stuff or have already fallen into it. And we have an excellent group of people over at Urban Alliance working out of there in the Group Violence Intervention Center that are doing terrific work, that have saved lives. So the new chief that we have and the former chief too, were very much into prevention. Their motto is, we will help you if you let us. We will stop you if you make us. And so that's kind of the philosophy that we're going on. But deeper than that is why especially young people get involved in violence. A lot of the shooting that we see in the city is the result of an argument. People that have no record, have not been involved in violence at all, go to a party, drink, and then somebody pushes them around. They think, oh, you dissed me. They go home and get a gun and shoot and kill somebody. And they've never had any stuff on their records. That's hard to stop. But we can do much more about young people picking up guns. And we're really focusing on that. So that's one thing we're looking at. The second thing with regard to, I think, poverty in the city. I mean, we're not really looking at too hard, but the statistics are terrible. And when we look at the number of children in the city that are living below the poverty line, it's about 31%. And if we look at black children in the city, it's 43%. Almost half of our black kids are living in poverty. Now that's just poverty. But if we look at Alice, if we look at people that are working full time, but not able to meet their basic needs, we're up around 60 or 70% among Hispanic and black families in the city. So this is a huge issue. And when you were talking about COVID, Regina, we had that program in place for the children's allowance, which was given $250 or $300 a month to families to take care of their kids. That stopped in January. And that has had a great impact. That has had a great impact. People that were making it barely now are struggling to do it. So we have to find a way to deal with this. And the city cannot do this by themselves, but the city can help with it. And we're working on that. So I strongly want to see that children's allowance thing put back in place. And I think we have to advocate for that really hard. I think the idea of universal childhood care, like, okay, 0 to 3 and then 4, that will have implications. It will free people up to do what you said, go out and get the training that they need to get jobs that pay living wages. And it will have a great impact on that. I've mentioned in another program that too many of our kids aren't getting to the promise. Especially boys. Girls are getting to the promise.
Right.
That's increased by 50%, the number of girls graduating from college in the city. But for men, for boys, for young men, it's flat. We're not getting there. We have to figure out something on that. We have to really put some more input. We did a lot this past summer where we put another $1.25 million into summer programs for youth. And we served another 4,000 kids that weren't being served before. And we did it especially with the community devising the programs. And that made a big difference. We're going to do that again next summer. KidNet is coordinating that, and they do a terrific job. KidNet is a model because what they've been able to do is a collective response. I was at a meeting last Friday where they're talking about summer programs, and they had 100 people in the room from all kinds of organizations, from the Boys and Girls Clubs to the Y's to everything, sitting in a room, planning together how we together can reach the most kids and have the greatest impact. We need to do that in other sectors of our community, in housing, in every other thing that we do. We got to work on that. So there's some really positive things on the horizon. KRESA has now land, and they've already begun to build a skills center for high school students where they're going to be teaching them skills to allow them to get into the trade skill things. That's going to be a big help. The Boys and Girls Club has raised $9 million to build a new facility. They told them in the beginning, they said, you could probably raise 5. And they said, no, we're going to raise 9. And they raised 9. And that will hopefully open next year. And they're telling me that they could serve 200 kids at a time in there.
Wow.
And they have great staff there. So that's really promising. A third area where I am very concerned, and that is what's happening on the north side of Kalamazoo with the pollution and the proliferation of that. And we have to do something about that, but it's not going to be easy. We look at graphic packaging, and some of it's coming from that. But some of it also is coming from the wastewater facility up there, which is going to be really hard to deal with all that. But we can't push that under the rug. When I ask about that, and I ask about it almost every week, they keep saying, well, the state is doing a study and saying what we should do. But they've been doing a study for over a year now, and we don't have the results yet. We have to do something. I mean, there's statistics that say the people live in that census tract have a life expectancy of 14 years less than the highest in our county. We have to do something about that. We have to invest in that and get something done. So I think in the city, there's some really promising things happening. One of the things is we just hired a person for the implementation of our climate change program. Not just having a program, but having somebody who's going to monitor that, who's going to enforce that and get that done. And that was a big step for us that we got those things done. Mm-hmm. So there are some of the things we're talking about in the city.
Yeah, all right. So we're thinking globally and acting locally here. All right, so Regena, what are you looking ahead to in 2023? What are the issues out there that we should be focusing on, paying attention to?
Yeah, one I think is a movement. It's the youth activism movement, and watching that, and you hear stories every day. Just at the World Economic Forum in Davos, that there was a youth report that came out, so they were very clear about how they want to see things change. We saw it in a response to gun violence when the students from Parkland, when their high school was impacted by that, they led a movement and to raise awareness about this. We even saw it in Black Lives Matter. I mean, the way that the youth use social media to organize. So I think like this is where change is going to come from in the future, and it excites me because based on studies and what the youth prioritize, they prioritize health and well-being of people over profits in the planet. The health and well-being of the planet as well. They respect science-based information. They're very inclusive because they've grown up in a more diverse world, so they care about the issues that impact everybody, not just one special interest group. So I just think that if we really pay attention to that and support that, some of the change that we keep saying that we're not seeing fast enough, I think the youth can fast track that. So that's what I want to see, how that moves forward in 2023. You talked about the gun violence and the things we can do locally in gun violence prevention. It's nice to see at the state level and even the federal level some bills that may get passed this year around banning assault weapons, red flag laws, mandatory background checks, all of those things, more gun safety. Because if we do find a way to get these guns out of the hands of people, we will see a change. Because everybody says globally, everybody else has these same issues, social issues, but it doesn't lead to the type of gun violence in the United States. And the issue is we have more guns available to people and accessible to people. So we have to change that and educate the public about that. And like you said, a public health response to that will also make a difference. So I think as we get some of these things passed with the power that we have now in politics, I think that we will see some great changes in 23. I hope so. I think everybody's fed up. And we have to be able to also hold manufacturers accountable.
Yes.
And hopefully there's some movement on that. And I think, if they have been at the root of this, we need to make sure that they're accountable for justice. This is not acceptable. And so hopefully we have stronger voices who can implement something like that. And then allowing the climate stuff, I think really exciting that we talked about the Inflation Reduction Act and all the funding that's coming to cities, into governments, and to businesses, and tax credits for consumers. And I'm starting to see, just as you talk to people, they're becoming more aware of making those changes because there are tax credits for using cleaner energy with your cars, with your appliances, saving money with your utility bills once you switch over. And so I think that that's going to become more normalized in our society and to make a difference around climate change. So I think as people start talking about this more and you start to see your neighbor doing something different and sharing the story about why they're doing it, that this may become more widespread, that we'll see consumer behavior changing around that in 2023.
Great. I agree tremendously. In the climate movement in general, the leadership of young people has been so critical. Greta Thunberg and so many others. Mark Kurtzgaard, the journalist who writes on climate issues, wrote an article a couple of years ago about the climate kids are coming. And the kids are coming in not just dealing with climate, but all kinds of important issues, as you point out. So the climate issue, obviously, that we will have another conference of parties coming up this year. Hopefully we'll move forward more than we did last year on that. I mentioned following the war in Ukraine and the increasing nuclear danger that's out there. Two other things that I would throw out there that we need to pay very close attention to in the coming year. One has to do with the new Republican majority in the House under Kevin McCarthy's leadership, such as it is. And again, what's going to happen with regard to the debt limit ceiling? That issue is the most important issue that's going to be confronted in the first couple months of this new year. That poses a very, very specific danger of crashing the world economy if Republicans maintain their extremist, unreasonable, irrational position on that, trying to take the world economy hostage in order to get some of their crazy extremist conspiracy addled policies put into place. And to cut Social Security and Medicare, that's just completely unacceptable. The other thing with regard to the House of Representatives is going to be the way in which they're going to carry out all these crazy investigations. You know, investigations into the weaponization of the federal government and into the climate or into the COVID crisis, and just so we're going to have a clown show of investigations that are coming down the pike from these extremists in the House of Representatives. The other final issue that I'll mention is the criminal investigations into Donald Trump. I mean, we're going to get indictments soon. I'm pretty confident of that. In Georgia, in terms of violation of the election law there, I think the special counsel in terms of January 6th and in terms of the document. So I think indictments are in the offing, and so I think one of the things we'll follow closely in the coming year are those criminal investigations. Done. We're under 5 minutes, so you got to go fast.
I'll just go real fast.
But what do you think?
For me, the economy, the world economy, the national economy, and the local economy. I mean, the world economy, we're seeing, it's on the verge now. I mean, I think Ukraine has really affected it deeply, as did COVID, no question about it. But we're seeing, the UN is warning us about the poverty that's taking place, particularly in African countries, made more acute because of climate change and their inability to get water and grow food. And I think that's going to catch up. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday about England. England's a rich country, but kids are hungry in England. Kids can't get enough to eat. And I think there's got to be a radical re-understanding of what the economy should look. The economy now is structured in such a way, worldwide and nationally, that those who have resources are going to increase their resources and the other people are going to stay the same or lose. And that's a disaster waiting to happen. So I think we had some models during COVID where we were able to provide for people's basic resources. I think it's going to be extremely difficult with Republicans in power here, but I think that has to happen. That's what I'm watching for the next year.
All right, that's your main issue there? So,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been a fabulous discussion. There's so much out there that we have touched on, and of course we'll be coming back in future programs to explore some of these issues in greater depth. Don, when you were talking earlier, I kept thinking back to my old mantra based on criminological research that social support prevents crime, right? I mean, that's it, social support at any level, whether it's within the family or locally or statewide or nationally. When social support is provided, when prevention programs are put into place, when resources are provided, people's basic needs are taken care of, crime goes down.
Yep.
Yes.
They're, you know, and there's such an abundance of evidence about that in criminology. Social support prevents crime. So how do we get to the point where we create the social support policies? And again, so much of this comes back to the proper role of government, which we are always talking about.
Yeah.
Well, to wrap up today, I just wanted to let people know that one of the exciting things happening here at the Public Media Network and for this program is that very soon we should have the ability to have guests on the program who are not physically present in the studio. That we should be able to Zoom in some guests. So I think all of us are going to start thinking about who's out there that we might want to bring in on a particular critical issue that we want to discuss. That could visit us by Zoom. One of the people I'm thinking about right now is my best friend out in Arizona, Ray Michalowski,
yeah.
who
He's
is
been
such an
working
expert
on
on so
Yeah.
many criminological issues. But I know all of us probably have other folks that we think would be great guests to come in. So dependent upon the issue that we're talking about, the critical issue we want to focus on, who can we bring in as a Zoom guest that would be able to contribute to that discussion? So that's one of the things that I think all of us need to think about and keep in mind.
Yeah.
All right, well, 2023 is off to a roaring but rocky start, I think, in so many ways, right? Given all the weather disasters that we faced, and the war in Ukraine continues to rage on, and the House Republicans are queuing up their disruptive tactics. So 2023 is going to be a very interesting year. There will be lots of critical issues for us to focus on. So thanks for helping to outline some of the issues we should focus on in the coming year. And we invite you to come back and join us to discuss these critical issues from alternative views. Thank you.